Welcome to Wall Street, the epicenter of financial power in America, perhaps the money capital of the world. The globally oriented financial firms based here in the New York Stock Exchange that operates here have extraordinary influence on the politics and policies of this country. No one has elected them, and in fact, these financial firms are trying to undo the regulations and new laws governing them imposed by the Congress. The people on Wall Street are just one of a number of unelected and very powerful forces that operate in the shadows, behind the scenes. They're the media forces, they're the military and industrial forces, they're the corporate forces, and they're the forces that we'll be investigating in this television series, which asks a question that most of our media does not. Who rules America? Every 4 years, Americans go to the polls to elect a president. It's a ritual that goes back to the founding of the nation in 1776.
Our economy seemingly on the brink of collapse.
High unemployment.
Every 4 years, politics and politicians dominate our television screens, dominate our news, and dominate our national discourse.
I'm Ron Paul, and I approve this message.
While independent watchdogs call this president...
President Barack Obama is running for re-election.
Mitt Romney stood with Big Oil for their tax breaks, attacking higher mileage standards and renewables.
He is attacking and being attacked by Republicans.
He said he would turn this economy around in 3 years, or he'd be looking at a one-term proposition. We're here to collect, all right?
The two parties may be fighting a political war, but pundits label it a horse race, fueled literally by billions of dollars in campaign contributions used for pervasive advertising.
To a place where one president's failed policies really hit home. Welcome to Obamaville.
The focus is on political personalities, not the forces they represent. A large industry of commentators and pollsters are paid to tell us who's ahead and who's behind. The focus invariably is on the candidates, not the issues, but everyone knows the campaigns are run behind the scenes by professional strategists, media experts, and political advisors.
Then there's going to be a one-term proposition.
The political ads are cynical and slick. Almost every word is scripted. Symbols trump substance. Slogans are market-tested, aimed at promoting perception and reinforcing prejudices.
That a rogue nation.
Marketing is the mission, selling, not telling. On one level, this whole spectacle is presented as a triumph of democracy, as if the candidate who wins will run the country. But being in office doesn't necessarily mean being in power. Americans believe they are determining their future. Are they? Do most know, or are they ever told, who rules America?
I just think that these people, you can't really see them.
Yeah?
That's what I think.
The people who rule America?
People are behind the screen. They are behind the screen.
Invisible.
To the general public.
And do you think people really know what's going on?
To some extent, yes, and to some extent, no.
To what extent yes, to what extent no?
About 50-50.
Who rules America? There's no one right answer. Pulitzer Prize-winning American historian Eric Foner says it's a question that raises many more questions about power that works from the shadows.
Who rules America? There's no one single, easily defined group who rules America, but I think not just now, but I think for a couple of generations, we have had what the sociologist Wright Mills called in the 1950s a power elite, an interlocking set of connections of people in business, in politics, in the military, who pretty much determine the parameters of possible change. It's not that they rule America in a conspiratorial way And of course, there are elected officials, but the leeway of those officials is constrained by what you might call the permanent government. Presidents come and go, but there's a kind of permanent establishment, what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, but now it's more a military-financial complex that really, determines the limits.
We're at the Left Forum, a gathering of progressive intellectuals and scholars and students held every year here in New York City. There are 1,400 speakers this year. They don't agree on everything, but they do agree that America is not the democracy it claims to be. They all want to know who rules America. Professor Stanley Aronowitz writes about the research of this man, C. Wright Mills, who a half-century ago wrote about the existence of a power elite that activists today refer to as the 1%, the people who run things.
His contribution to understanding the nature of power in America is in the first place to identify three institutional orders that really together form the power elite. An elite that is, generally speaking, unresponsive to the people, unresponsive to democratic liberties and democratic procedures. And he said the three groups were the corporate capitalist institutions, the military, and the third one was the top layer of the political directorate, he called them, and they are the national leaders like the executive branch of government, not even Congress. He said Congress was in the middle levels of power. It doesn't really share the decision to make war, the major economic policies and so on. It participates at some level, but basically it's out of power. And he said that really has undercut the whole pretense of progressive and of representative government.
This may be why in recent surveys, only 7 to 9% of the American people in both parties believe that the Congress, the so-called People's House of Government, is representative and capable of solving the country's problems. If politicians are trapped in a polarized and highly partisan stalemate, who does exercise the power to decide what the country's priorities and policies should be? We asked J.K. Fowler, an editor of The Mantle, a political magazine.
I think it's extremely complicated. I think there's not one particular answer for it. I think that a lot of the stuff going on in America right now is being led by money and moneyed interest in Washington in particular. But I think there's a bubbling movement from the ground up as well that's happening.
Is there a ruling class in America, or is that an outdated concept?
No, I'm a strong believer that there's a class in particular in New York City but I don't think they're not hidden away in some room with nefarious deeds in mind. It's more structural. There's certain clubs they go to. There's certain streets they live on. They're interacting with one another more.
We put that question to Erin Crowell, a 30-year-old working-class mother from a small town in Wisconsin who is working 2 jobs while pursuing her education. If I was to ask you, who runs America? Who rules America? What is your, what is your perception of that?
People that have the money to do so, people that have the money and the resources to send a lobbyist to Washington, nobody from my town could afford to send a lobbyist, and say, hey, Harley Davidson is, threatening to move their plants to China unless, everybody takes pay cuts, and could literally shut our town down, We can't afford to defend ourselves.
Do you feel, as an American citizen, that you have power, in our country? Do you feel as if you have the ability to get your dream achieved?
I feel like it's slipping away. I don't think I do, because it feels like the closer and closer I would get to that, just a dream for me is to finish college, and take care of myself and take care of my son, but even that now, and I understand, a lot of people in my position aren't even able to get that far now.
So if the citizens who are supposed to be in charge don't feel they are, who does? What we found is that by and large, it's the wealthiest Americans who call the shots through unelected institutions that drive agendas in their own interests. There may be a cabal running things, but in the end, the state and the system merges, argues Canadian political analyst Leo Panich.
I don't think there's an external force controlling the American state. The American state is capitalist to its core in the very way it's organized. It doesn't do it because there's too much influence from Wall Street. It does it because it is structurally embedded with Wall Street. It doesn't do it because there's too much influence from a military-industrial complex. It does it because the military-industrial complex is inside the state, is funded by the state, is part of the state.
Sure, there are people who conspire and there's people who act in secret, but capitalism is not a conspiracy. The people who have the wealth, they're not a conspiracy. We know who they are. We know how they collect this money. They take it out of our pocket, they put it in theirs, and it's not a big mystery.
There seems to be corporate forces in addition to Wall Street that essentially help guide our political and economic direction. Leading are America's top corporations. Political analyst Michael Clare has studied the political economy of oil for 20 years and says a lack of media coverage keeps the public in the dark.
Does the media cover it?
The media doesn't cover this for the most part. In fact, the media is largely in league because of the advertising dollars that the oil and gas lobby provides. They're very heavily dependent on advertising revenue, so they're very careful in what they say.
Who are they accountable to? Are there laws really controlling and regulating what they do?
There are laws, but they have been written largely by their lobbyists to favor them. So, in fact, the laws, for the most part, are in their favor, not in the favor of most Americans.
Is there an issue where we've seen this very clearly, where the interests of the oil industry or the energy industry is in conflict with the interests of Americans?
Well, I would give an example that the oil industry has been pushing for drilling in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of Alaska, for example. And they get all kinds of tax benefits for that kind of deep water drilling. And they were able to do so during the Bush period with absolutely no oversight whatsoever, hence the Deepwater Horizon disaster.
Most Americans experience the oil industry in two places: at the gas pump, where prices often rise because of speculation, not just supply and demand, and also through TV advertising that paints this very profitable business in the most positive of terms.
I'm still here, and so is BP. We're committed to the Gulf for everyone who loves it and everyone who calls it home.
That's good for our country's energy security and our economy.
Which brings us to another set of corporations, the media companies. Jeff Cohn has been in the media and written books about its impact in shaping how Americans think about their country and its system of power. He says media companies push propaganda for war.
It's the same exact media quoting the same exact experts that pushed our country and the world into a war with Iraq. And we were told by these media, oh, we're so sorry, we didn't know, we made a mistake, next time we'll be more vigilant. But here we are next time, 10 years later, and the same media are blowing smoke about a weapons program in Iran that doesn't exist. There was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq either. And so we're hearing, it's like, when the war drums are beating. And I worked in mainstream television news in this country during the run-up to the Iraq War. When the war drums are beating, they don't let you put on opposing views. We tried to get opposing views that question the evidence, the intelligence that would justify an attack on Iraq, but we were kicked off the air. And now you're finding it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare that's happening again.
At the same time, Jeff, most people who work in major media, and I of course did as well, don't believe this. They don't buy this. They feel like they do have the freedom to cover issues and that the networks are much more diverse in their point of view than outsiders like you and maybe now me would say.
Well, the way to rebut that fiction is just to look at what happened in the wake of the Iraq invasion. Those of us who questioned the evidence that they were a weapons of mass destruction threat, we were totally right, and most of us got kicked out of the TV networks. The people who got it wrong have promoted up. So this idea of diversity in the mainstream media or good journalism will win out certainly hasn't been proven in the last 10 years, where the journalists who got it right have been punished, sanctioned, or kicked out of the media. And the journalists who got it wrong, most of them have more power today to blow smoke at Iran than they had even when they were blowing smoke at Iraq.
Those people, the people who own institutions, are usually very conscious of their power, not just as individuals, but as part of a dominant class, says independent TV producer Brian Drolet.
So there's a lot of talk here about Democrats and Republicans. Should we vote for the Democrats? Should we vote for the Republicans? There's a lot of talk about, the rich versus the 99%. But it's kind of, there's a certain kind of amnesia about the structure of our society that at one point in this country at least had some currency. In the 30s and even in the 60s, you could talk about the working class. Nobody talks about the working class. It's all about there's a middle class and then there's the 1%. As if there's no, and I guess then there's some, poor blacks and Latinos or something, right? And I think that word has been sanitized and scrubbed out of the vocabulary of the people of the United States, including out of the vocabulary of the left. Now, that's not the entire left, but even the people that use the word class don't seem to have the ability to phrase it in a way that actually means something to people.
To talk about class is not to talk about a conspiracy, but a complex system that's evolved over the years, a system that is stratified and uses campaign contributions and lobbying to ensure that the politicians do the bidding of the companies. So these are the building blocks of the analysis we'll explore in this series on Who Rules America. The argument is simple but hard for many Americans to comprehend because many of us want to believe the myths we learned in school that make us feel superior to other countries and other peoples. This has been called American exceptionalism. Many in America believe that God created this country as the greatest country on earth, and that's what makes it so special.
So you really have to start with that as a basis for how the United States was founded.
Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is one leader of America's indigenous people, the first Americans.
They were the ones to be eliminated because it was their land that was wanted, not even their labor. Like in Latin America, the indigenous people were enslaved and made into peasants, peons. But in North America, the Anglo-colonialism in Canada, U.S., New Zealand, and Australia had the motive of simply wiping them out and taking their land. So it's not just that they weren't included, they were to be eliminated.
And so questions about the custodians of real power and who rules America lead back to debates on how to remake power, how to challenge its distribution, and make it more transparent and accountable. These are the issues that the Occupy Wall Street movement is raising as it challenges institutional power in an attempt to revive grassroots democracy. David DeGraw explains Occupy's origins.
I mean, it was like such a confluence of events. Everything was moving in this direction. I was looking around the world. There was protests happening in Egypt, and then it moved to the Arab Spring, Tunisia, and all throughout Europe. It came back, and it was just a matter of time before it hit the United States. And really, if you look, the occupations globally they became like the thing to do. So it was just a natural progression for it to show up here. I feel like it shows up here because, even though wealth is so concentrated, the people have a media system where they're so propagandized and they feel isolated. But, Occupy shows that people are, not suffering alone. They're coming out and raising awareness, and we changed the national discourse.
The movement is up against powerful forces with large budgets and the backing of police forces and the political establishment. While these activists are on the front lines of the fight for a people-ruled America, many of its people share the same hope.
You have a sense of class being important in this country, that there being like an upper class or working class?
Absolutely. I'm a waitress at a very nice restaurant, and it's very clear to me, what my role is and who I am, and you can tell just from the dialogue that I have with people, Recently, I talked to a general manager of a fairly large business in our town, and when I mentioned that I was going to a public school, I got kind of an eye roll, and oh yeah, my tax dollars pay for that, and it's.
So you feel like there's all this resentment against working people, kind of feeling like they don't deserve what little they're getting? Absolutely, and especially with the recent attacks on public sector employees, like on teachers, and people are saying they don't deserve those benefits. We all don't get those benefits, so they don't deserve them either. Or like, why isn't the conversation? Maybe we should all work to get those for everyone instead of taking it away from the few that do have them. When I hear you talking, I realize there's such a bigger picture here than most people even understand. That we have, a country where the dream is slipping away for so many people, and they don't feel particularly powerful. They don't feel like they can do anything. They can achieve anything. They can make a difference.
Right. Well, I think the dream is shifted to hopefully I wake up tomorrow and I'll be able to pay my rent and keep a roof over my head, or it's just like, I'll work on achieving my dream tomorrow, but today, I have to go to class, and I have to get my work done. I have to go to work, and I have to try to squeeze a couple hours of sleep in, and then, and it's.
Now you're here at this conference with all these brilliant theoreticians and analysts and professors and experts and leaders. And how do you feel about this idea that people have to get together to make a difference?
I think it's wonderful. I feel so blessed to be able to be here with people like that, because I want to learn. Somebody had said to me, well, why don't you leave where you are? And I don't think that's the answer. I think that it's my job as somebody who cares about these things to learn from these people, to learn from these brilliant minds, and so I can take this back to people and show them and explain to them where we don't have access to this kind of thing every day, and to hopefully try to enlighten them a little bit.
Aaron expresses the hopes of many ordinary Americans who want to reshape the nature of power so that the 99%, not just the 1%, can rule. But as you can see and hear, it's not a battle she feels she is winning. Perhaps that's why she, like many, want to know who rules America. The question of who rules America has been debated throughout America's own history. It was originally raised and answered to some degree by the American Revolution in the 1770s that fought for independence from the British Crown so that Americans, at least some Americans, could rule themselves, or at least they hoped they could.
We're at Columbia University with Dr. Eric Foner, a historian and writer and teacher. here at the university for a long period of time.
I think what is unusual today is two things. One, the degree of inequality. Never before has the very, very top, the 1%, had so much of the national income and wealth in its own hands. And, so that the gap is greater than ever before. And secondly, Occupy Wall Street is not primarily a movement of farmers, of laborers. It doesn't have the same base. People need to learn history. That's part of our job, to know that this issue has been around for a long time. There was nothing un-American about raising the question of economic plutocracy, economic inequality. It's as American as apple pie. And, I think that the Occupy Wall Street people are, legitimate heirs of a long and venerable tradition in this country.
Today, the activists of Occupy Wall Street are continuing the fight for independence and economic justice from domination by a small elite in the name of the majority, the 99% of America.
I do think what's been brilliant about the Occupy Wall Street movement is the framing of the 1% versus the 99%. And I think what we basically have is an undemocratic power structure that goes across political, economic, social, and cultural lines.
What kind of impact has Occupy Wall Street had in raising basic questions about the nature of power in America? We asked sociologist Stanley Aronowitz.
It has an impact on perception. It has changed the conversation. The question is whether or not it will be able to change policy. And the argument that I would make is that it should not worry about changing policy in the short run. The only way to change policy in the long run is going to be to create even a bigger movement. And in order to create that bigger movement, what it has to do is it has to ask the question, what kind of a life do we want to lead? What is the good life? What is a vision of the way in which we want to live?
David DeGraw coined the 99% 1% phrase and was an early Occupy organizer. He explained why Who Rules America remains an urgent issue.
So you have big banks and concentrated wealth that's just rigged the political process. Investigating it, we have a country where U.S. millionaire households have $46 trillion of wealth. It's just a mind-boggling number. So, over the past generation, all the wealth has gone to the top. Really it's 1/10 of 1%, more than 1%. But, breaking it down even further, you have 400 people who have as much wealth as 155 million Americans. So that's 400 people who have as much wealth as half the population.
The seeds of a battle that many of the occupiers see as a new American Revolution is not really new, but deeply rooted in the unresolved history of conflict in the United States between those who own and control its resources and those who want economic equality.
So the question is, who rules America? And that's a funny question because then you talk about power. The first thing you have to understand is America is a business venture. Like stolen land, stolen property, capitalism, and it's just about making money.
Many revolutions start at the top. In other words, the people who began the struggle against Great Britain were merchants in Boston and New York, plantation owners in Virginia. Most of the founders in Virginia are slave owners. But what happens is, as the struggle intensifies, they have to generate support among ordinary people. And when you do that, you break open the political system and you open the door for very, very different kinds of demands. Slaves start demanding their own freedom. Women, Native Americans, start demanding greater equality. So what happens at the beginning when a more privileged class begins the resistance, that doesn't necessarily tell you how the whole process is going to take place.
This conflict between the 1%, actually the 0.001%, and the 99% had its echoes here in the home of America's anti-colonial uprising, in the back streets of Boston, where a freedom trail today commemorates a massacre by the British and a fight for liberty. And that's where we'll take you next.
Was the American Revolution really a revolution?
The British thought it was a revolution, no question about that. It was not a social upheaval in the way, let us say, the French Revolution was, but it certainly overthrew an entire system of government. It replaced the ruling class with another one, so that seems to be what a revolution is about. And it raised these questions of equality in the society. Not just equality in terms of 1% and 99%, but the role of slavery in American life, the status of women in American life. It unleashed a kind of struggle for equality among all sorts of groups, which continued long after the revolution was over.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. That's one of the most famous poems of the American Revolution. And here we are in front of the statue of Paul Revere, the man who alerted all of Massachusetts to the British troops coming into their communities. We're on the Freedom Trail in Boston, where the American Revolution is remembered. Well, what kind of a revolution was it? What actually happened here in Boston back in the 1700s? What have we learned since then? Thousands of tourists and students visit these revolutionary monuments every day, but most have only a foggy idea of what really happened and tend to repeat the mythologies that are taught in their schools. Here was Paul Revere. Paul Revere was one of the great revolutionary heroes. Are you kids here to see the statue of Paul Revere?
Yes, we are.
Can I ask you a question about it? Sure. We're doing a little TV program here.
Yeah.
Who was Paul Revere? What was this all about? Do you know?
He was a founding father. Ride.
Yeah, Midnight Ride.
To warn about the British were coming.
Did you know that he was a very rich businessman, a silversmith here in Boston, and that he wanted to be in the Continental Army and they wouldn't let him in? Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Did not know that.
Did you know that in Boston there was this merchant class, business leaders, the 1%, who were really running the whole show in many ways, and that the people were not as involved because back then there were slaves, there were indentured servants, there were a lot of people who didn't have a say in what was going on. Did you know about that?
No idea. I didn't know anything about Paul Revere.
We would love to learn about
Where did you learn about the revolution?
I'm supposed to learn about it in history, but I don't pay attention.
My brother Bill here has taught history to students in Massachusetts for many, many, many years and has followed, the various debates about our history. What was it about this revolution? Was it a popular uprising or was it sort of led by elites here in Boston?
Well, both were true. There were popular elements. Ordinary people did resent the British. Ordinary people did participate in riots and boycotts. But there was a 1% back then. The leaders of the revolution both led it and channeled it. They were certainly not above using words like liberty and freedom to deflect and distract people from their own discontents in the colonies.
And their own interests. I mean, the business class of Boston didn't want more taxes on their products. They wanted to compete with the British goods. They felt they shouldn't be taxed. And as a result, there was the original Tea Party here in Boston.
Right. And there were, merchants like John Hancock, who was into smuggling goods. And you're right, they didn't want to pay British taxes. I mean, there were other factors behind the revolution as well. But when this revolution was codified in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, the people who were invited were the large landowners, the slave owners, the merchant class, no women, no Indians, no blacks, no working people.
Actually, there were slaves that were inspired by the revolution to try to get their freedom. Some actually did.
I think the idea of the revolution and the idea of democracy were radical, inspiring, revolutionary, in ways that actually might have made the leaders uncomfortable, since some of them themselves owned slaves. They really didn't want this to go viral in the way it did around the world.
So who ruled America then? In a way, their grandchildren are ruling it today.
And sometimes direct descendants of those people. So, there was a certain amount of class mobility, indentured servitude disintegrated due to the chaos of the revolution. But I don't think the people who led the revolution really intended a social revolution. That was really not what they were thinking about. After the revolution, people like Daniel Shays in Western Massachusetts, a farmer, a captain in the revolution, did try to inspire, organize another rebellion against those who he saw
as replacing his British masters. This time, they were the colonial leaders. So here we are, 225 years after the Shays Rebellion rocked Western Massachusetts in a challenge to the 1% of those times. We have a memorial for Daniel Shays and the men who fought with him. And what's interesting is we have American flags being put, in a sense, almost at his tombstone here, marking support for the values and the aspirations that he fought for.
My name is Dave Rothstein. You're at the Stagecoach Tavern in Western Massachusetts, town of Sheffield. And this painting is a painting of Daniel Shays' militiamen. Daniel Shays fought in the Revolution. They came back from the Revolution and found their farms being foreclosed and many put in prison because of the same debt crisis that we're experiencing now. There are many similarities, but essentially, one of the promises of the Revolution was to annul the foreign debt. And the farmers came home and discovered the debt was even greater and the banks were even tougher.
Today, the Shays Rebellion is mostly forgotten, but it lives on YouTube with songs and dramatic recreations.
Shays now unsheathed his sword and ordered the fife and drum players to strike up a tune. The men began marching in cadence.
The irony, says historian Eric Foner, is that Shays was just a frontman for a mass movement.
In fact, it was the opponents who said it's Shays' rebellion in order to find a kind of boogeyman, they could attack. So let's forget about Shays as a person and think about the mass movement, the farmers, the ordinary laborers who took to the streets, shut down the courts, and said, wait a minute, we had a revolution. We have installed a government that's supposed to represent the people here in Massachusetts, and yet it's talking, it's the bankers and the landowners and the merchants who are getting the benefit of everything.
It was the first Occupy Wall Street movement. They petitioned the government in Boston for redress, and the government ignored the petitions. And they're having still had their arms, they went to these court sites and picketed to prevent the courts from sitting. Succeeded to some extent until private militias were formed and the Massachusetts militias were formed to suppress it.
It was suppressed right near here, right?
The last battle was fought in Sheffield. It was led by Brigadier Ashley, the Ashley house is still here. And Colonel Ashley, his parents, were one of the heroes of the Revolution. So here we have the same family building independence, but then trying to suppress it.
If many white Americans were disappointed by the achievements of the American Revolution, what about blacks and Native Americans?
In 1730, when Sheffield was incorporated, there were 30 black families in Sheffield. Half were slaves, half were free. But the famous story is, again, at the Ashley house. One of the servants, Elizabeth Freeman, called Ma Betts, overheard all the talk about the Massachusetts Declaration of Independence at the dining table. And it occurred to her that she might qualify. And she actually filed in the court of Great Barrington and won her freedom. So here you have the court giving freedom on one hand and suppressing freedom on the other.
Years later, a small black community in the area that Daniel Shays made famous became the home of a young man who had become a leader of the fight for civil rights. He coupled concerns for racial equality with demands for economic justice. Today, in the center of his hometown of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, there's a wall mural celebrating his political and intellectual contributions. It includes quotes from President Barack Obama and Martin Luther King. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Du Bois was one of the giants of the 20th century, although of course he's born in the 19th century, Du Bois put forward the issues which are still with us, the race issue in America. You know, he said in 1903, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. It's still a problem in this country and around the world. Du Bois talked about economic equality and how to gain that, and he grappled with these questions. He's a brilliant writer, a brilliant thinker, and much of what he said is still relevant, I think, to thinking about American society.
What about Native Americans?
They were the ones to be eliminated because it was their land that was wanted, not even their labor.
Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is part of America's indigenous movements and says the people we call Indians were being exterminated. We asked her about the American Revolution.
It wasn't a revolution, it was a war of independence from the colonial overpower, but it wasn't an anti-colonial revolution like the Bolivarian revolutions in South America or the Haitian Revolution.
So there are many different, even competing narratives about the origins of the United States.
The United States, of course, was founded as a settler state, as a colonial state, became an imperialist power. And the democracy has always been an oligarchic democracy, a capitalist democracy with a rhetoric of populism, which is so strongly based on race. That is, if you're not black, if you're not a slave, you're not indigenous. If you're white and a settler, then everyone can be a king, everyone can own land and be a landlord. So all these peasants who came as settlers, the dream is to be the king of the hill. And so it's a very insidious kind of democracy because it's an illusion.
Illusion or not, this is a subject that needs to be examined if we are to understand who rules America, the origins of the 1%, and then teach about it.
So this is all part of the history that most Americans probably don't know. Did you find when you were teaching students here that many of them just didn't know much about their own history?
I think there are many students that I taught in one of the towns that fought at Concord who were never even in the spot we're standing in now. And I think that that's true, that many kids were not familiar with that history, beyond local battlefields and so on.
The other thing about the Revolutionary War, which is relevant to today because we live in a globalized world, is that this revolution started locally here in Boston, but soon the British were involved, the Dutch, the French. It became a war of many different countries all fighting on American soil.
Well, very true. And the French intervention was very critical to our success. It wasn't all through the force and valor of our arms. There were other people involved. But I think the idea itself has played a revolutionary role in history. But the idea itself did not create a deep social revolution in the United States. And to this day, people are distracted by words like liberty and freedom and justice in the same way that they were back then.
Ironically, the original Tea Party, which inspired the modern right-wing Tea Party movement today, was actually a protest against an earlier form of corporate imperialism.
Why was tea the issue, not corn or whiskey or something like that? It was because the East India Company had gone bankrupt in China, and the Crown, the British Crown, bailed them out so they wouldn't, lose their assets. But then the Crown looked around and said, well, what does the company have that we can sell? Well, it turned out what they had was tea. So they decided to market the tea. And that's why it was tea that was the taxed issue. So here you have a big financial failure, and it was global. The implications rippled across the Pacific, rippled across the Atlantic, and we have the Boston Tea Party.
Throughout our history, there have been sort of conspiracy theories about all of this. I mean, today, for example, both the right and the left seems to see the Federal Reserve Bank as sort of a conspiracy concocted in 1913 without any proper process and kind of running the show.
Yeah, well, you know, conspiracy theories, conspiracy thinking is deeply embedded in our political culture. My PhD supervisor, my mentor, Richard Hofstadter, wrote the famous book in the 1960s, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, in which he traced out various kinds of conspiratorial thinking, whether it was Catholics who were before the Civil War trying to undermine America, or you know, various other groups at various times, immigrants, others trying to, you know, destroy the American culture, or the Trilateral Commission, remember them in the 1970s, were supposedly ruling the whole world. Now the Federal Reserve, right, if we only abolished the Federal Reserve Bank, everything would go back to some utopia of the past.
Throughout U.S. history, you see various right-wing movements point out scapegoats in the society, and they're usually the folks who are already marginalized in some way or another. And what happens is that there comes a moment when it becomes really useful for the elite powers, whether they're in government or corporations, to encourage these movements. So you get a Tea Party, or you get a militia movement like in the 90s, or you get the Ku Klux Klan in the 1800s. And what this is all about is taking angry, mostly white people who are mostly somewhat privileged and convincing them that they're about to fall down the social economic ladder.
I guess the basic problem with conspiracy theories is that no group can fully determine what happens. Even people with great power launch things, and then they kind of lose control of them, and things happen in a way that is unpredictable.
When you look back at history, and you maybe can see, because of, you know, it's a long time ago, all of these forces. Yet today, somehow, in the news, we never see these forces. What we see are politicians spouting various, you know, rhetoric and speeches, but we don't really know whose interests they're serving, who's behind the scenes.
Well, this is why we need research. We need an understanding of who rules America. Because the mythology today is that it is the people who rule America. And most folks don't know a great deal in terms of specifics about the role that corporations play, the way politicians are tied to corporate interests.
Change is possible. I think when one talks about who rules America and a power elite, one should not use that to simply fall into a kind of quietism and say, well, nothing is possible, no change is possible, everything's under control. Many of the major popular movements in our history have been big surprises. You know, nobody expected them to come. And I think the same thing with Occupy Wall Street. Nobody expected Occupy Wall Street to come up simply out of nowhere. And so I think, we have seen that over and over again in our history, and we will continue to.
People say the 1%, and we are the 99%. But when I broke down the numbers, it was really it is a couple hundred people in this country that have immense wealth. If you look at our election process, it's something like 1/100 of 1% accounts for something like 80% of the campaign finance. I mean, that's insanity. I mean, it's a rigged game.
And now the ball of history has been passed to a new generation, fighting to transform a large and complex country with many power centers. But just as in the past, it is determined minorities who make the difference. An elite made the American Revolution, and as we will see, a power elite still rules.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike.
When retired World War II General Dwight David Eisenhower ran for president, he was hailed as a military savior, an all-American hero from the plains of Kansas.
Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country. Vote for Eisenhower.
No one expected that in his farewell address he would identify and oppose the emergence of a new power constellation, the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
His was a prophetic speech, especially for a military leader who saw that a fusion of government and corporate power could lead to what he called unwarranted influence and misplaced power. 50 years later, on the warning's anniversary, President Eisenhower's own granddaughter, Susan, documented how the military-industrial complex had grown. She wrote, "In less than 10 years, our military and security expenditures have increased by 119%. This new book on the clout of the military-industrial complex by William Hartung details the power it wields. He told me how it works.
Military contractors, uniformed military, the Pentagon, basically pushing their interest at the expense of taxpayer, national security, in some cases our civil liberties.
Is it a description of an actual reality?
Well, the military-industrial complex is probably more real now than it was when Eisenhower coined the phrase. A company like Lockheed Martin, not only are they building missiles, they're building cluster bombs, they're building submarines. At the same time, they're helping process your taxes, they're counting the census, they're running fingerprint databases for the FBI. So it's kind of morphed from just the military-industrial complex to sort of the national security state. So you've got surveillance as well as weapons building.
Hartung says these companies, in effect, dictate our foreign policy.
They've sort of captured our foreign policy and captured our military policy, really for special interest purposes to a large degree.
Writer David Swanson believes that this military-industrial complex relies on wars or the threat of wars to stay in business.
President Eisenhower pushed war propaganda in the very same speech and throughout his career, but he could not have been more right. I think he probably did not imagine how huge the problem of what he called the military-industrial complex would become. I describe it as a banker bailout every year. It is $1 trillion, over $1 trillion every year into the machinery of mass murder. It is over half of federal discretionary spending from the U.S. government. It is as much and more than all other nations of the world put into the military each year. It is much of it unaccountable. The Pentagon routinely loses quantities of money that are as much as most other governmental departments get.
It's not just that more money is being spent on arms, but the rise of the military-industrial complex has been accompanied by an overall rise in corporate power, and not just in the military sphere. Military contractors now have disproportionate influence, says Sheila Krumholz of the Center for Responsive Politics.
There is a huge sum of money coming from defense contractors in particular, and these range from AT&T and Boeing, the largest multinational kind of Goliaths. Their primary source of revenue may be telecommunications or transportation, but they have huge contracts worth a ton of money with the DoD and military. There have been a number of pieces of legislation aimed at both making that connection more transparent and trying to put a lid on the kind of pay-to-play method that has ruled, for instance, earmarks.
Have we seen a pattern of military and industrial collusion and industrial companies that do business with the Pentagon giving more and more money to politicians?
Many defense contractors were making contributions, spending lots of money to lobby, and in exchange winning contracts that maybe they weren't the best organizations to benefit from. So there has been a lot of research done about how money greases the skids for defense contractors. I'll also say that the revolving door plays an important role. So it's not just money, it's other forms of elite influence where people in the Department of Defense are kind of lining up their jump to the private industry where they can rake in huge sums of money and lucrative posts in the private industry that they used to regulate.
Alongside the military are huge intelligence agencies with vast budgets to spy, run covert action operations, collect personal data, and conceal how powerful interests operate. Today, the former head of CIA runs the Pentagon and was replaced by a general. The head of the Navy SEALs runs the Central Command. Secrecy is pervasive in a national security state, even as groups like WikiLeaks try to disseminate hidden information.
WikiLeaks, your baby, has, in the last few years, has released more classified documents than the rest of the world's media combined. Can that possibly be true?
Yeah, can it possibly be true? It's a worry, isn't it? That the rest of the world's media is doing such a bad job that a little group of activists is able to release more of that type of information than the rest of the world press combined.
Years earlier, an auto executive turned Defense Secretary Charles Wilson said what's good for General Motors is good for America. He saw no distinction between an elected government and an unelected corporation. GM was a car company that became a major defense supplier, buoyed by military spending, and then years later became a mortgage lender, driven by Wall Street-originated and often fraudulent subprime loans, until it nearly collapsed and had to be bailed out by government. The United States Supreme Court, in its Citizens United decision, has decided that corporations like GM have the rights of ordinary people and can openly and sometimes secretly lobby Congress and the public or finance political campaigns to promote their agendas. There are now many criticisms against Citizens United. Many of the arguments can be seen in this video by the Story of Stuff campaign.
We have a democracy in crisis. 85% of Americans feel that corporations have too much power in our democracy and people have too little. 85%. Hey, that's a majority. So let's get together and take our democracy back from the corporations. It's the first and most important step in making real progress on all the issues that people care most about.
There is also a counter-campaign underway against corporate control of politics, focusing on two billionaire political donors, Charles and Edward Koch, two brothers, both industrialists, and both funders of conservative campaigns, including one to suppress voting by Democrats. Filmmaker Robert Greenwald has distributed this video nationwide.
Folks like the Koch brothers are attempting to ensure that as few people of color and as few young people show up as possible.
We've undergone a coup d'etat. We live in a corporate state.
Chris Hedges is a best-selling author and former reporter for the New York Times.
The people who rule America are the large corporate entities, which are supranational. They have no loyalty to the nation state. They are harvesting the country just like they're harvesting the rest of the globe. They're implanting a global neo-feudalism where workers around the planet have to be competitive, which means being competitive with sweatshop workers in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour, or prison labor in China. It's a global neo-feudalism. It's one that is unassailable, completely untouchable, and more powerful than the host governments that where they're nominally based.
Hedges is not alone in this view. Professor Michael Clare specializes in studying the country's largest industry, oil and gas.
I would say that the oil industry, or energy writ large, coal, natural gas, uranium, is the most powerful lobby in America, the most powerful economic interest, and it's tied to other powerful interests: automobile, highway construction, suburbia, many other industries, tourism, are all linked to energy, and they work together to keep America addicted to oil and to avoid the transition to alternative fuels.
Do they have an influence on our politics? Do they have an influence on what happens in Washington, what happens in the ballot boxes of America?
They're the biggest contributors to electoral campaigns in general, especially to the Republican Party, and I think they have a very powerful influence.
Do you think most Americans know how powerful they are?
Only the people who see this power in their daily lives have grasped the strength of it.
For many Americans, the military-industrial complex is seen only as a source of jobs, and in fact, military contractors win political support and federal funds by promising to create jobs.
There are real jobs, people working in the weapons factories and all the subsidiary subcontractors, but it's a fraud because you could take those same dollars and put it into any other industry, into infrastructure, green energy, education, or even into tax cuts for working people and produce more jobs than you do with the military spending. So it's worse than nothing, purely on the economic terms.
For years, there have been protests against America's wars and the military, but most have targeted politicians, not necessarily the corporations who profit from making weapons and other products for the military. One of the groups that's most visible in challenging militarism is a women's group, Code Pink. Medea Benjamin is a co-founder.
I've learned that we don't rule America. I've learned that the Democrats don't rule America. The corporations rule America. I've been doing the work on the wars, and I've just been floored at how powerful these weapons manufacturers are and how powerful the contractors are, and that they have the ability to kind of keep wars going. I mean, that's pretty amazing when you think about it. Like, I'm just doing a lot of work around the drones issue. Do you know there's a drones caucus in Congress? I mean, instead of having a caucus to feed preschool children, they decided it was more important to have a drone caucus, and that's because all the manufacturers in their districts are funding them.
They are quite open about it, and in fact, over 50 members of Congress have created a caucus for drones, where they openly promote the use and sale of drones at home and abroad. And then they've now authorized the flight of at least of up to 30,000 drones in U.S. skies for whatever purpose. This is in contrast to the lack of any caucus for senior citizens, for children, for health coverage, for green energy, for human beings. There's a caucus for robots.
Eisenhower was so right, and he was so right when he said that it steals money. It robs us of food for our children, of health care for our parents. He was so right. And it's just worse and worse. And you get the little puppets in Congress, and I live in Washington now, so I see these little puppets and wish that they were like the NASCAR drivers that had to have their corporations on their suits. But they don't rule America. The corporations obviously rule America. And when it comes to war and peace, those corporations are so powerful that they've kept us for the last decade in war, and if we don't do something about it, they'll keep us in war for the next decade.
Beyond the debates about the role of the military, there may be a deeper challenge, because the United States has evolved from a nation into an empire with a far-flung system of bases, economic interests, and intertangled business dealings all around the world. Top political leaders interact with corporate leaders at meetings of elites like the Bilderberg Conference, the Trilateral Commission, and the International Monetary Fund meetings. It's all part of a global structure of corporate culture, politics, and power. Some, like the billionaire George Soros, told me a while back that the World Economic Forum is more like a networking party than a decision-making venue. Decisions are often made behind the scenes, not at public events.
The Davos meeting is an enormous sort of cocktail party. A lot of contacts, people meet, and so on. A lot of things are discussed. It's actually very convenient because you can meet a lot of people whom you want to meet in a confined period of time. And it's also a media event.
Is it also a symbol of the growth of sort of economic power, of over political power, a lack of sovereignty, a loss of sovereignty by some countries?
Well, it is actually symptomatic of the age, because you have presidents and prime ministers courting the financiers and the industrialists.
Only a few Americans seem to understand how corporatization and globalization go hand in hand. Walter Teague was one of the first activists against the Vietnam War. He believes that Americans can't see the facts because they're trapped in myths. I asked him how he would explain this situation to people on Mars.
I'd have to explain some very crazy things to them. I'd have to explain it in terms that they would perhaps understand. I'd have to not use some of the terms that Americans commonly use, because if you use the language that we're taught in school about democracy, free will, all of how the United States is number one, uber alles, right? All those terms lead the person to not being capable of understanding what you're saying, which is that there are really, and have been for a long time, a very small percentage, 1% or something like that, who really make most of the decisions. But they are smart enough to make them in a way that keeps most Americans, until recently, from realizing that they're being ruled.
We cannot undo the plutocracy, the kleptocracy, the lack of representation without dismantling the military-industrial complex. This is the 1% of the 1%. This is where we give a banker bailout every year, and we don't get a dime of it back. We borrow it from China. We pay it back with interest. We keep interest rates ridiculously low. We crash Wall Street. We bail it out because we've created a war economy without any need for war.
Well, I think if people had a better sense of how these companies, how the uniformed military, how their allies in Congress are basically running the show, scaring us into spending on weapons we don't need, I think they'd have the beginnings of a tool to do something about it. But I think absent that information, there's sort of nowhere to start. There's nowhere to sort of plant your feet and try to fight back against it.
So I'd have to tell the Martians it's going to be very hard for you to understand why Americans don't see how they're being screwed. They don't see it, except when it gets so bad or so contradictory or so blatant or so personal, and then they wake up one day and say, oh my God.
Does this mean in a way that business, that Wall Street, that defense contractors and others have disproportionate power? In other words, are they kind of one of the forces ruling our country that most people don't even know about?
I think that the money has great influence across the board, particularly where the issues are arcane and they seem disassociated with the average Americans, where constituents aren't paying attention and they're not being heard by their representatives in Washington. I think where people are paying attention, where it becomes there is a hue and cry from regular people, it's hard for the money to beat out the merits on policy. Politicians usually will not risk the political liability of being seen as catering to their the interest bankrolling their campaign if the voters are paying attention. They're usually not that unwise.
Most of the public doesn't interface with the military-industrial complex because they participate in the economy as consumers. But even there, they're being affected by a power shift and economic inequality that drives them deeper and deeper into debt. George Scribner is an executive with a corporation that advises other corporations. Today, it takes $200,000 a year to feel somewhat affluent. I asked George Scribner how he thinks growing inequality is affecting our politics. Who's in charge of our country? We keep reading more and more about big money in politics.
There was a great article of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And I think it might have been Vanity Fair, but I'm not positive right now. But they made a point that in politics, that I've been making in terms of business, is that since World War II, it was head count that made a difference. One person, one vote. So you play to the vote, One person, $1. You played to as many people as you could to get the dollars. Now, because the assets are concentrated at the high end in the hands of the few, actually, money is much more valuable, both to politicians and to marketers, than the mass of people that comprise the middle class.
So is the mass of people being left out now, the mass of Americans?
They aren't being left out, but they're certainly less important. So I think in a variety of ways, you'll see them being less catered to and manipulated more, in a sense. And in politics and in terms of marketing, there'll be fewer products and fewer services.
That's one view from inside the corporate world, essentially saying that the majority of Americans have less economic power and, as a result, less political power.
People with money rule America because people with money can acquire power through that. But we all have, the great thing about America is we all live within the myth that each one of us can make a difference. And I think there are enough opportunities for that to happen that makes me think that the future won't be as bleak as it seems sometimes.
Let's hope so. Certainly most Americans believe their future is bright, but given the trends we've explored about who's in power, there certainly are doubts, especially because of the danger and threat of new wars that are being planned secretly, according to Professor Stanley Aronowitz.
There'll be a war against Iran. As a matter of fact, unless you refuse to count embargoes, things like that are going on at this very moment, that is to say in March of 2012, that is virtually an act of war. That we are saying to the Iranians, either you bow to our demand that you do not develop nuclear weapons and you renounce nuclear weapons, or otherwise we will continue to bar your goods from going back and forth. I mean, after all, the market is part of the system. So they're saying you have no market rights.
So there is a war underway right now.
I think so.
But most Americans don't really know it, do they?
That's right.
Do they really know about this power elite? Do they really know about what C. Wright Mills talked about so many years ago? Why is that, and how can that change?
Because we don't have a left that really continually, in an effective way, talks about who has power in America. We have the Occupy movement talked about 99% being deprived of economic power and about inequality, but it is not even close to being an analysis that can be disseminated throughout the entire society. We don't have a system of daily newspapers. We don't have a weekly newspaper. We have Twitter, we have, various other kinds of social media that we have access to, but it does not replace the kind of systematic analysis that could take place as a result of having our own media.
So Americans, in a way, are still in the dark, and I think, the Left Forum and so many other efforts are attempts to challenge that, to change that.
Well, yes, that's right.
Even as President Eisenhower exposed the military-industrial complex, he also expressed a very American, deeply felt desire for peace and justice that history has largely forgotten.
From the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love.